I'm David Farmer from the American Institute of Mathematics. Today we're here to talk about the research statement, which is one of the key components of an application for a tenure-track position in mathematics. The research statement is one of the items the search committee will use in determining the short list of people who are invited to campus for an interview. Judgments made from the research statement include the quality of past research, the likelihood of future research success, the prospects for receiving funding for your research, overlap with research interests of current department members, and whether or not students can be involved in your research program. Different institutions will give different weighting to these factors.
Here are some things that I think are important for a research statement. I think that, first of all, the very beginning is a really crucial part. So the first part of your research statement should be written in rather broad terms. Something that I would not do is jump into a very particular one of your very particular problems that you worked on. What you want to do is indicate the area and your particular area of research, and you want to give kind of a good overall picture. What is the big picture there? What are the important things that are happening in this field? So you should do that. I mean, and this is really good practice. This is maybe the hardest part to do, because it's often easy to write about your own research in a very particular problem. But you have to remember, first of all, that on committees, there can be people that are not in your area reading this, and they may be far from your area, so you really have to put it in context. You have to somehow give the big picture. Then it's okay, after that, to launch into the things that you've been thinking about, the things that you've been doing. For postdocs, maybe a description of your thesis problem, the work you've done since you've been a postdoc. And that is going to, of course, take up a good portion of this research statement. And then after that, I think, or interwoven with that, is the fact that you need to present sort of a plan for future work that is sort of robust enough. So I think this is important no matter what kind of institution you're going to, because if you're going to a research, something like an R1 research place, or you're writing it for that particular place, although you might want to have two versions of this too, you need to convince people on that hiring committee that you understand the big problems in the area, that you have enough sort of ideas for work that are going to carry you into the future, that you might be able to support graduate students, your own graduate students with your work, that you might be able to apply for grants. So you're not going to say all that explicitly, but if you have an ambitious enough program with enough sort of meat there, then that I think will be clear. So that's sort of future plans, future work. And even if you're not, if you're going to, say, more a liberal arts college or a place where it's teaching research, emphasis more, you still need enough, and you still need to convince them that you've done enough research, that you have enough research ideas to carry you further. Because in those places, you're going to tend to be a little more isolated. You're going to have less time. So people will want to see that you have enough, you have enough ideas to kind of continue your research, and that you're able to move forward.
A lot of what I say applies equally to the the research summary and a research proposal you submit for funding.
Right.
Both of them are persuasive documents. The fact that you've logically explained things and certain material is there is irrelevant if a quick reading of that document does not convey what you're trying to do. It's not like a proof, which you could say, my proof is correct. It's, are you being persuasive or not? And a lot of what helps the persuasiveness is the structure of the document. So here I'm showing you part of someone's research statement, which I can tell you right away, it's not effective. I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's not effective. What even from your seats you can see is missing is there's no section or subsection headings on these pages. The people on the committee don't want to read page after page, especially if it's technical detail. And if it's not technical detail and you're actually changing topics in the middle of the page, then they're not going to notice that without a section heading. Okay? So in many cases, just by adding section and subsection headings, you can vastly improve your statement. But let me put this in broader context of how panels work. Both research proposals and job materials are evaluated by panels. The panel's first and most important goal is to come up with a shortlist. Now, before we talked about that there's a longer shortlist along the way, and often you can formally get to that point. You don't get on the shortlist in either case without an advocate, somebody on the panel who becomes your champion. You need to give ammunition to your champion. Okay? Now, if this is the kind of thing you've written and it's largely technical, the best your champion's going to be able to say is, take my word for it, this is great work. Okay? Now, some advocates, that's all they need to say, but often that's not the case. So it would be better if they could say, this work is central to lots of the other work going on in this area. Look, they've described the connections with other areas, and they can point to a section called Connection with Other Work. Okay? Or, especially at a liberal arts college and other smaller places, it's nice if more than just a few people in the department are interested in your research. So, if you have a section called historical context, or X as a tool, where X is the particular thing, and people can read an accessible introduction and say, oh, I can imagine talking to that. So if you give your advocate ammunition to explain why other people will be interested in their work and will be able to talk to them, that's great. Or maybe you're at a place, or you're applying to a place that has lots of honors theses for their students. Well, a clear explanation in your research statement that non-experts can understand will go a long way to making the case that you may be able to advise students in projects. You could even have a section called possible student projects, but if that's at the end of an incomprehensible 15 pages, no one's going to get to that point anyway, or except your hardcore person in that area who will not be able to make a good case that you could advise undergraduate students. So that structure really helps a lot, and thinking in terms of how would someone quickly find the information in here that says how your work relates to other recent work, or how it relates to other areas, or possible applications. If you have actual possible applications, then you should have a heading somewhere that explains that, and then in that section you have comprehensible words about that. So it's thinking in terms of the structure, and imagine someone who looks at it and sees as headings, oh, there's historical context, this section explains why this tool is a broad use, and this tells how their work relates to prior work. Just by reading the section headings, they might have gotten a good impression about you. Oh, this person's doing interesting work. They can explain stuff pretty well, and they only read the section headings. That could happen, and that would be a good thing. And often it's not, you may need to add more material. Like if you don't actually define your fundamental object, you should. Now, some of you may have received mistaken advice from someone like your advisor who says, just write it for the experts. Now, that's bad advice, but there's a grain of truth. The grain of truth is the advisor and other big shots in that area don't want to read historical background or context and stuff like that. Well, what will they do when they get to the section called historical context? They'll skip it. Okay? If it's not in my area, I'll read that and I'll find it interesting. When I get to a thing called technical details, I'll skip it. A good research statement is not read in entirety by anyone because there's no person on earth who actually wants to read the whole thing. On the other hand, you can make everybody happy when they read it because everybody can easily navigate to exactly what they want to get out of it. So that's how I would propose you think about restructuring your thing. You will need to add some background and context. If you work in multiple areas, you may need to separately introduce things several times. But if you have a paragraph which starts about your result and then starts talking about other work before that, well, that should be a section break, not just stuck in the middle of a paragraph.
Just to add to what David said, people that are perhaps not in your area that are reading this may only read that very beginning, that introduction, because after that they won't understand things. So, as David said, if you can section that out, it's helpful to them. I also don't think these things should be overly long. You're not writing a grant proposal here. You're just writing a research proposal. I mean, a research statement. And again, just think about the people reading this. They're going to have a lot of these to read. They don't want to read overly long technical ones. I'm not saying there shouldn't be anything technical in it. I'm just saying it should not be too long, if possible.
If you're in double digits, that's probably too long.
That's too long. I mean, I think if you can keep it to 5 or 6 pages, it's better.
Some of you are getting to the point where you're going to have to jettison your first results. You've done more recent things. A few years have gone by. It's not my whole history of research. It's what you're up to now. So some of you can cut out or relegate them to something small. Well, let me make a comment about the similarities between proposals and research summaries. Don't go looking for successful research proposals as a model for your own research proposals. They're a persuasive document. If you're a big shot, a poorly written proposal with no context, no explanation, that merely lists what you're planning to work on is completely persuasive to the panel. But that's not a model you should use. So, again, I don't know if the same advice applies to research summaries. People don't usually ask to view other people's research summaries. You often ask to view other people's proposals. If it's a big shot who's received funding for years, that's an indication that they probably don't write good proposals. Because they don't need to, because they're so good at research. So don't go looking for models like that. But the advice we're giving you here definitely applies to your NSF proposals.
Yes.
There's a big difference between someone who's given a problem by their advisor and solves it versus someone who actually understood, why is that a good problem? What does it lead to?
Right.
What are other people doing? So you want to be the person who actually understands why you did it. And especially at a liberal arts college, a place with a big variety of faculty, being able to share perspectives and explain why your work is interesting. So it's good it's interesting to you, but it does require explanation to other people for why they should find it interesting. No, you'll reference other things. If you're talking about context and prior results, you can have the references to those. And we weren't including the references necessarily in the page count.
Right.
No, you need a technical part. Okay. But it can be done in a way that the people in that area see that that's what they want to pay attention to, and the people outside that area see to skip it.
Yeah, I would say, in my mind, I was thinking about a half page.
But if you work in if you work in areas such that the people in that area think of it as multiple different things, you might have a short introduction, and then you might have short things later.
Yeah.
So the one page the non-experts read might not be literally the first physical page. They might skip around, and good section headings, appropriate use of bold and small caps can help that happen.
I think it's really good to have different areas. I mean, if you have interest in those areas and you've done work in them. And I think you can section those, as David said. You can have a section on the different areas in maybe the more technical part. And as David just said, you could also have a little bit of context in front of each of those areas. So to put those in some sort of bigger picture. And then at the beginning, you can have a broader statement that talks about your interests. And I mean, as long as there's some sort of overlap or, whatever these fields sort of fit in, you can say, I'm interested in the broader field of something and with applications to something, and I've worked in all of these areas. But at some point you do need, you want to make sure that by the time someone is done reading whatever part of this they've read, they understand that you understand how your mathematics fits into the sort of bigger picture of mathematics. To the historical problems of mathematics, to important problems of mathematics, to the timeliness of those problems. So if you can get that across, that's really good somehow.
Well, you definitely want to talk about both things. So you need to establish that you've done interesting work, and so the word interesting is interesting. Don't say that your work is interesting, because it's not. It's interesting to you. It's okay, but on the edge to say, this is interesting because. But to announce that your work is interesting, it automatically invites the reader to say, well, by comparison, you must think your work is more interesting than others. So at best, your work is interesting to you, and my work is interesting to me. But interesting work is work that other people find interesting. So you need to establish credibility that you've done good work. But if you don't have a trajectory with clear plans that are likely to result in new theorems or get funding, so you have to have both. And what I alluded to before is you may want to not mention your oldest results, but definitely you want to mention your most interesting results, which hopefully are your more recent ones. So yeah, it's not a pick and choose. You need both there. Yeah, so if you study L functions study for many things. Someone whose research is in p-adic L functions would have a very different introduction to someone who studies the L functions of Siegel modular forms. Okay, there's still both introductions about L functions, but because there's particular target they're heading toward, they would have vastly different introductions. Like in one case, it might be about, sum of 1 over n squared is pi squared over 6 as an example of a special value which leads to p-adic L functions. And another might be Dirichlet's L functions about primes and arithmetic progressions. There could be almost no overlap in the introduction on L functions to those two research statements.
This doesn't have to be overly long or overly simplified, but you could start off with, several years ago, so-and-so investigated the question of some invariant in topology. I'm just making this up, and the research I'm doing is a part of that, and it fits in this particular way. I mean, something along those lines. And if you can somehow say why that is important, why you think it's important at least, just something where someone can get just a picture in the beginning of what you're trying to do. And so we've been on lots of proposal panels, and if I have a first page where I can understand, I'm very grateful for that when I'm reading these things, because and these are proposals that are supposed to be in my area, but still they can be so muddled that you don't know where people are heading in the beginning. So if it can be clear in the beginning and you can say things pretty simply, it's very, very helpful to the person reading it. It sort of grounds them so that they can read the rest of it. So don't worry about it. I'm contradicting myself right now, but don't worry about it being sort of too easy. People usually make these things too hard, too technical.
you're going to need help from other people.
Right.
You're going to need experts in the field and non-experts to read and offer you feedback. And you want to not use everyone at once. Like get an expert or non-expert to read it, revise, then get fresh eyes to look at it. And it couldn't hurt to tell them the context in which this will be read. So like, I'm using this as an application material at an R1 school, what do you think? Or I'm applying to a liberal arts college and they ask for a research statement, what do you think? And you may need two versions. You may need two versions of everything. A cover letter for research place or primarily teaching place. A research statement in two versions. You know.